Hey guys, welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you multiple ways to create gradient borders using CSS, and one including JavaScript. All the ways are depending on different scenario, and you can skip to it by the timeline given in the description below. So let's get started. I just have a simple HTML template with a CSS file linked. And the CSS file has some basic styles like background color, and the body has display flex, so we can see the element in the center. That's all. Now the first scenario is when you need the most basic border gradient with no curved edges. For that we will have a div element with a class border gradient. Then we will go to the CSS file. Here let's give this border gradient class some styles like width of 400 pixel, height, let's say 300 pixel, and background color is some gray. Now let's add a border style and give it 5 pixel width or whatever size you want, and solid and no color. Then add a border image style. Inside it, add a linear gradient with angle at 90 degrees. And let's use red and blue color. And don't forget to add a 1 outside the bracket. Okay, now let's check this in the browser. As you can see, we have our border gradient applied successfully. But what if you want to add a border radius to this? If we try to add a border radius to our border gradient class, let's say 10 pixels, and we see the change. You can see the border radius doesn't get applied because border radius doesn't work with border image. So to have a gradient border with curved edges, we will require a wrapper element over the main element we want the border on. So let's put this another element, and we will place the original inside it. Now let's add a class called wrapper on the parent element, and we will add some styles to it. The first style is display. We will give it display flex. Then justify content is center. And align items is center as well, so the child element is in the center of the parent. Next we will give it some padding, and the padding has to be equal to the border width you want, which in our case is 5 pixels. Next let's remove these border image style as we don't need it. And we will take the linear gradient part from it and add it as a background in the wrapper class. If we check the current state of the border in the browser, it does not look good because we still have to do some more things. So back in the wrapper class, we will add a border radius just like the border gradient class. And we will also remove the border style from the border gradient class. And now you can see we have a curved edge border gradient. But the corners look weird, right? The border looks odd. So how do we fix that? Let's go back to VS Code. Here we have to make sure that the child element has a smaller border radius than the parent. So as the wrapper has 10 pixel border radius, the border gradient class will have 8 pixels, basically 1 or 2 pixels smaller. You can change it according to yourself. And now you can see the corners look good. But what if you want to have a transparent background or a color with some transparency for the element? If we check the element in developer tools, if we try to change the background color to something more transparent, you can see that the wrapper element's gradient is showing up, but we don't want that. So how do we fix it? Let's go back to VS Code. And for this method, we don't need a wrapper element. So let me comment it out. We only have our main border gradient element with simple basic styles. And we go back to our HTML. Let me comment out the wrapper element as, here we will use an SVG element inside the border gradient element. It's going to be a simple SVG. First thing, we add a width of 400 pixels to it, just like the border gradient element. Then we add a height of 300 pixels, same as the border gradient element. Then we add a viewbox attribute, which will have the value like this, 0, 0, 400, and 300. After that, we create a DFS element inside the SVG. And inside that, we create a linear gradient element. On the linear gradient element, we add some attributes like x1, which will be 0%, y1 will be 0%, x2 will be 100%, and y2 will be 100%. Then inside the linear gradient, we will have a stop element. In the stop element, we add the attribute, offset of 0%. Then we add a stop color of your choice. I'll go for red. Then duplicate this stop element and change the stop color to blue and the offset value to 100%. let's just add an ID to the linear gradient. Okay, we are done with this linear gradient. Now below the DFS element, create a rect element. We add a fill transparent property to this rect element. Then we add a stroke with the value as a URL with brackets, and inside the brackets we add the ID of the linear gradient. Then let's add the stroke width of 5 pixels. Then we add the X and Y values and make sure that these are half of the stroke width. So in our case, it is 2.5 pixels. Then the last two values are width and height, which will be equal to the width and height of the SVG minus the stroke width. So for us, width is 395 pixels and height is 295 pixels. And this is all we need for the SVG, so let's check in the browser. You can see that the SVG is placed correctly. Let's change the background color to something more transparent. And you can see the actual background with it. Let me place an image in the background to show you. You can see the image through the element, and we have the gradient border correctly placed as well. Let's add some rounded corners in our border by giving the rect element two attributes called Rx and Ry. Both represent the roundness, and we will make it 10 pixels. Now let's see it in the browser. You can see some white color overflowing on the corners. That's because, as I said before, the parent element has to have higher roundness value. In this case, it is the border gradient element, so let's increase its border radius. Now you will see we have a gradient border with rounded edges and transparent colors. But this only works when your element isn't going to change size with different screen widths. Because if I show you now, the element stays the same and can overflow. But there is a solution for it as well, and that requires some simple JavaScript, so let's quickly add it. Let's first change the width and height to something which changes with the viewport. In our HTML, let's add some IDs to our main border gradient element and the SVG and also the rect element so we can select them in our JavaScript. And now let's remove the view box, width and height from the SVG as we won't need it anymore. And in the rect, we remove the width and height as well. Now let's add a script tag, and you can keep it in a separate file, but I'll just add the JavaScript here. We first get all the 3 elements we require using document.getElementById, and we add the IDs we just created. Now we use setAttribute on our SVG. The first attribute we add is width, and its value is going to be the client width of the border gradient element. Next, we add the height attribute, the same way as before, and the value will be div.clientHeight. Then we add the view box, and for its value we first add a template literal. Inside it we add 0, space, 0, space, then the client height, then client width. Next we set attributes to the rect element. First one is width. Its value will be the client width of our border gradient element minus the stroke width, which is 5 pixels. Next we add the height, which will be client height minus 5 as well. And this is the code we need to set the SVG correctly in the element. Now let's place all of this code inside a function. Let's call this function setSVGDimensions. We paste the code inside. We need a function because we will put it in an event listener. Let's add a window.addEventListener with the event resize, and we place our function in it. This will make sure that the SVG is always in the correct size. And we will call the function once as well, so that the SVG updates when the script is run. And I think this is it for this method. Okay, I think I put the wrong value in the view box. Let's check. Yeah, the client width comes before client height. The proper view box value is 0, 0 client width, then client height. And this should fix the issue. You can see the SVG is properly placed and adjusted, even when I change the screen width or height. You can use these methods according to your preference. By the way, I do have one bonus method, which is when you want a gradient from one color to transparent. And it will work with transparent backgrounds and curved corners. So let's comment out the JavaScript and the SVG element, as we won't need them in this. Let's go to the CSS file. In here, we will add a position relative to the border gradient class, our main element. After that, let's get the pseudo element after for this class. Inside, we add the content as an empty string. Then position absolute. Then we put 0 for each, top, left, bottom, and right. Then we add a simple border and choose the color you want. I'll go for red. And this is the important style called mask image. We can use a linear gradient in it to hide one side. In the linear gradient, add the angle according to yourself. And make sure that the part you want visible is a solid color. I'm using black. And the part you want to hide should be transparent. So here, according to the angle, the left side of the border will be visible and the right side will be invisible. Now, let's check it in our browser. Now it looks like a gradient of red to transparent, and we only needed CSS for it. And let's add a border radius to this element. Maybe you can add another element with a different color from the other side, and that can look like a two-color gradient border with only CSS. I haven't tried it though. You can change the mask image linear gradient to hide or show more of the color. And that's it. These were all the methods I knew which you can use to create gradient border. If you have any other way, you can let me know in the comments. But thanks for watching the video.